Thank you. It's indeed a great honour to be asked to give this prestigious lecture. Point of departure. Methodism has an enviable record for social and theological radicalism. And Methodism's incorporation of Arminianism, social holiness, connectionalism, and the affirmation of experience as a criteria for assessing revelation. Our tradition has done much to develop a radical form of ecclesiology that affirms equity and social justice. I've been shaped by this tradition, and I would not be the person I am without that formation. I'm a cradle Methodist. I've been loyal to it, even though it has not always been that loyal to me. This presentation seeks to illustrate how this radical tradition has not been immune from the stain of whiteness, and within that, concomitant forms of white entitlement and white exceptionalism. As a cradle Methodist, I know that there are things about Methodism that are not replicated in other traditions. That our commitment to a movement, our commitment as a movement, to social justice underpinned by a belief in an all-enveloping and transformative nature of grace, prevenient grace, sanctifying grace, assuring grace, that all this enables people to believe that we can be more than the limitations of our bounded human identities and the social locations in which we were born and are often constricted. But this has been one of the charisms of Methodism and is seen as being at the heart of some of the greatest socio-cultural and political movements in British history. That indeed, the birth of the British Trade Union movement owes more to Methodism than it does to Marx, given the witness of the Tolpuddle martyrs. Our anti-racist credentials can be seen in the fact that we were the first denomination to appoint a racial justice officer, and we invented Racial Justice Sunday. And yet the uniqueness of the social and theological vision created by John Wesley and his many successors has to be balanced alongside an all-enveloping world of whiteness, in which white exceptionalism and white normality is taken for granted. That Methodism, despite its own particular narrative, our tradition nonetheless was still a part of Christendom. That when John Wesley inadvertently created a movement of people called Methodists, let's be blunt about this, that he never had someone like me in mind as he did so. That when the modern conception of Methodism came into being at Union in 1932, once again, people like me were not in evidence. We were not at the table when plans were being hatched to create a new united church, bring the various strands of the Wesleyan tradition together. Once again, it was white people, and particularly men, working and executing these plans. We take for granted, therefore, the white nature of such forces of history. And we take it for granted to such an extent that we rarely see it and give it any thought. And yet, as I will show, that the history and legacy of a specific and particular implication, that this history has a particular implications as we consider how we can become a more justice-orientated and inclusive and diverse body. We may have moved beyond the constrictions of patriarchy, perhaps as a church, but I would still contend that our magisterium of white people, duly elected and appointed to prominent posts, still run Methodism under the aegis of a neo-colonial ethic of whiteness, as surely in 2020 as if it were in 1821 or even 1921. Christendom represents a larger context in which Christianity emerges at the dawn of modernity and the expansion of the world beyond the parameters of Europe. The development of European empires across the world in which the Christian church participates represents a conflation of political and ecclesial power. And whilst Methodism was never a great player in this, and indeed John Wesley is to be commended for never being an English nationalist, undoubtedly our tradition nonetheless benefits and is a part of a larger religio-political world of white power in which Black people are often constructed as the other. Christendom has given the church epistemological power. So for 3/4 of her life, the church in its collective entity was a primary institution that helped to define truth and the rationale for what it meant to be human. This, allied to the belief in the divine right of kings, creates a synergy between the church and political power that reinforces the epistemological weight of ecclesial authority. And so Willie James Jennings, in his recent book, After Whiteness, seeks to explore the ways in which whiteness becomes the template on which notions of truth, belonging, acceptability, mastery, control, that these things define what is seen as normative. So in my first category, I want to explore for a moment the ubiquity of whiteness. So in his latest text, After Whiteness, Willie Jennings critiques the phenomenon of whiteness, arguing how the conflation of European mastery, white male colonial power, and the internalization of notions of white superiority become the means by which epistemology is developed. Whiteness is not about the epidermis. It's not about those people who are racialized as white. Rather, it is the whole edifice of a reality of how we even discern what is normality and how ideas and practices are developed under whose gaze and imprint are notions of truth discerned and developed. Whiteness has rarely been acknowledged in any intellectual discourse, particularly in theology. And so Jennings's work looks particularly at matters of how whiteness conjunct with patriarchy and colonialism unleashes an ethic of mastery, self-sufficiency and control as the defining elements for what constitutes notions of development and progress. In moving into an understanding of whiteness that is not simply about the epidermis, Jennings is illustrating how this is better understood as the wider conceptual and practice template that defines truth and acceptability and belonging. And the best way I've heard this described is by rethinking a long-held analogy. The historically liberation theologians like myself, Black liberation theologians, I've often seen white supremacy as analogous to a ravenous shark that patrols the oceans, preying on weaker, smaller fish. Scholars like Jennings et al. Are now arguing that whiteness is actually not the shark, whiteness is the sea itself, i.e. whiteness is the whole world in which we live. Whiteness is the ethic of mastery and control that grows out of European expansion and colonialism. The world in which John Wesley was formed and through which Methodism came into being is one that was shaped by an all-enveloping ethic of whiteness. Wesley, to be sure, was a more enlightened exemplar of the nature of whiteness in the 18th century epoch than many of his contemporaries, but he nonetheless was immersed in a thought world that always assumed the superiority of whiteness over other forms of epistemology, in which a hierarchy of power often goes hand in hand with this construction. Social science scholars often talk about a hierarchy of credibility. This refers to the ranking of epistemological power in which people's account of truth are attested to according to their place in the social and ecclesial hierarchies. So according to this theory, bishops are more reliable conveyors of truth than priests. Priests in turn are more reliable conveyors of truth than lay people. Educated lay people are more reliable than uneducated ones. This hierarchy of credibility dominates most social and ecclesial bodies in terms of the conflation of epistemology and knowledge acquisition, which then leads to issues of power. And the critical question I want to pose for churches, but particularly for Methodism, is how do we deal with the hierarchy of credibility when we also assert that in the economy of God, the first shall be last and the last shall be first. In truth, in contemporary Methodism, one might well argue that the first shall be first and the last shall be patronized and told how important they are while simultaneously ignoring everything that they have to say. This leads me to Methodist mythology and self-deception. I've lost count the number of times I've sat in Methodist meetings and sat in front of, as a layperson, then more latterly until 18 months ago, a member of the connectional team, and sat in front of white leaders who spoke about Methodism being non-hierarchical. And yet the existence of a hierarchy of credibility speaks to an enduring rank of power that is connected to human subjectivity, that is often mapped onto social location and social status, which in turn is often then linked to the surreptitious power of whiteness. I worked for 3.5 years as a member of the connectional team in Serving the Learning Network. And the first half of the 21st century, I was, and I put the following words in capitals for emphasis, I was the only Black British-born person who was raised in the British Methodism serving in the connectional team. I'll say that again. I was the only Black British-born person who was raised in British Methodism serving in the connectional team. So what seems commonplace for white people, i.e. you are born into and baptized into the Methodist Church, you got Sunday school, you got your fellowship, and possibly a university. Maybe you go to the Methodist Society or you go to some ecumenical form of church fellowship, or maybe you go to the Christian Union. Then possibly you then go into lay ministry in your local church, serving in various offices. Then perhaps you then gravitate into connectional ministry. Some people go into presbyteral ministries, other people will serve as lay people. You go into the connectional team. All this is self-evidently obvious for white people, but not for Black people. At one point in the Learning Network, when I worked as a ministry development officer, there were more white South Africans who were migrated from Southern Africa to Britain, serving in the connectional team, and particularly the Learning Network, than Black British-born people like myself. As I once opined to a friend, and I put in brackets, I use this word specifically for my good friend, the Reverend Charity Hamilton, who often tells me off for using lofty, pretentious language. So this is for her. As I once opined to a friend, it seems easier to get a job in the connectional team if you're a white person from Bloemfontein than if you're a Black working class person from Bradford. And the issue for me wasn't simply that this was demonstrably the case. There were more white South Africans in the Learning Network than Black British-born people like myself. It was a fact that when it was brought to the attention of so-called white powers that be, no one cared enough to do anything about it. Imagine if that were the case. Imagine if it were the case that white working class people had no expectation of ever having paid roles within their own church. Or actually, if it were white people, then it was white people who were migrated from Eastern Europe, no one born and brought up in Britain. It would be a scandal. And yet I spent 3.5 years as the only Black British-born Methodist in the Learning Network, and it wasn't uncommon to find myself often as the only Black person in the room. And yet on not one occasion was it ever noticed that in 21st century Britain, there was little in the way of ethnic or cultural diversity that one might have expected in January 1965, in the year in which I was baptized into the Methodist Church at Prospect Hall Methodist Church by the Reverend Roy Laidley. So Genesis' latest work looks at the historical phenomenology of whiteness and its construction into Western epistemology that becomes the framing norm that constitutes normality to such a point that it is indeed the sea in which we swim, that most people do not see. This norm around which I've spoken in the previous piece of work that I call a theology of good intentions, is predicated on whiteness, maleness, middle-class Oxbridge education, and bourgeois socio-cultural norms. It's also based upon an ethical patronage in which white subjects look for people who mirror their own socio-cultural norms and are supported and encouraged into ministry. It's why it's still incredibly difficult for Black subjects who are marginal subjects, and for women, particularly if they're working class, and for people whose sexuality is seen as transgressive, to be seen as easily fitting into this existing constructive. So this then brings me to issues of patronage and power. Discernment and training, particularly for ordained ministries, is often overlaid by metaphysics. So what some scholars call a form of pneumatological pedagogy, where the Spirit guides human activity and knowing in order to reveal the truth of God's desires. But the critical question is, but how do we assess what the Spirit is revealing when the collective forms of discernment are enacted on candidates for authorized forms of ministry, when that is overlaid by this hierarchy of credibility that then helps us to decide who is called by God? That as Willie James Jennings says, that the coloniality of whiteness finds expression in this outworking of patronage, in which patriarchy, hierarchical epistemology, coupled with concomitant notions of mastery and self-sufficiency, are conjoined to dictate who is acceptable and who isn't. Applying Jennings to the bourgeois processes of discernment and selection for ministerial candidates in the British system of theological education is to remind ourselves of the respectability politics that drenches the whole enterprise within a preferential option for white middle-class people. It's in this regard that our processes are the antithesis of the radicalism espoused in the iconic work of the late, great Marcella Alpheus-Reid and the liberative praxis of indecent theology. That I would argue that Methodism as a whole, but theological education in particular, operate in larger under the aegis of patronage, is one that is the antithesis of Alpheus-Reid's notion of the indecent. That's an exercise in neo-colonial rubrics of bourgeois acceptability politics. So the significant challenge that faces British Methodism in the 21st century is, how do we match the rhetoric of an egalitarian and radical theological tradition with the flawed nature of our ecclesial practices? In short, what the church has imbibed is what I've described in the previous piece of work as a theology of good intentions. In using this term, I'm pointing to the way in which apologetic rhetoric becomes a means by which we resist any significant attempt to institute systemic justice in the life of the church. That namely, when acts of injustice are committed, be linked to race, sexism, homophobia, or disability, whether they're intended or otherwise, the knee-jerk reaction is to apologize. Now, to be clear, the apology in itself is not a bad thing. But what happens is it's meant to serve as a kind of magic placebo that will cure all ills simply by being invoked, i.e., to apologize, that is meant to be the end of the matter. There is invariably no serious analysis as to why the injustice occurred in the first place, let alone any form of sanction that will be invoked if this form of injustice is repeated. It's as if the apology has magic properties in and of itself that will salve all wounds and ensure equity and justice for those who are wrong. This is the very working of a theology of good intentions. And what exacerbates is that when the victim of the injustice has the temerity to refuse to accept the salving balm of the apology, and sometimes the guilty party don't even know what they're apologizing for, save for the fact that by apologizing, they believe it will bring matters to a swift and timely conclusion. That when those on the receiving end of injustice refuse to accept this construct, they become the villains of the piece and are then deemed the problem and are sanctioned for being uncooperative. I've lost count the number of times in disciplinary situations brought by Black people, it ends up with the Black people themselves being sanctioned for being difficult and problematic, not the people who have been racist to them, either as individuals or as congregations or as circuits, or indeed the very system itself, controlled and patrolled by whiteness. Suddenly, such individuals become the bad guys for refusing to comply with the iniquitous framework into which they've been expected to facilitate a process that leads to their silencing and continuing marginalization. Now, at this juncture, it's important that I make the point that, of course, whiteness, because it's not about epidermis, means that Black and brown people can often be called and pulled into this in terms of its collusion. I was recently in conversation with my friend, the Reverend Jarrell Robertson Brown, who was on the receiving end of rejectionist homophobic attitudes from a Black majority congregation. Reading Jarrell's forthcoming book, which will be out in the summer, which I implore you to buy, Black, Gay, British, Christian, Queer, is to read of the ways in which my friend's Black queer body has been rejected by other Black people who have bought into and internalized the tropes and the ethics of a neo-colonial form of whiteness, in which the strictures of respectability politics that are based upon forms of heteronormativity that were constructed by white Victorian imperialists and not Black people themselves becomes an ethic in which he himself has been rejected. So witnessing the rejection of my friend's ministry due to one facet only of his life, as if all the eminent gifts and graces he had were rendered null and void by this specific and particular facet of his life, is to see the painful internalization of whiteness within the corporate edifice of Black Christianity writ large to a sad and disappointing degree. As I have read Jarrell's brave and never bitter words of regret, he has, as he has reanimated his story and calling and passion, and his passion to be one of Mr. Wesley's preachers, it's just to witness the ways in which an internalized form of racism, the tropes of whiteness, built on coloniality and notions of acceptability politics, for some and the rejection of others, still remains a toxic residue of empire. And it exists within the body politic of our nation, and it's witnessed in the electronic lynching of him earlier this year for an innocuous tweet. In my previous book, Theologizing Brexit, I spoke of how Black people are often, or Black gay people are often identified as the edge within. That in this case, that in Jarrell's Black body, he was not only othered because he was Black like me, there was the added layer of the problematics that existed in terms of his transgressive sexuality when that is also included. And so the respectability politics replete within whiteness construe that some people are deemed to be the enemy within. In the case of my friend Jarrell and many other Black LGBTQI people, there remains a form of neo-colonial conscription of Black bodies within a stultifying layer and conformist respectability politics that was engendered by white mission Christianity, into which white and Black Christians have both been acculturated. Essentially, mission Christianity, which provided the parameters within which Black bodies have been policed since the epoch of slavery, that this remains a hermeneutical conduit that details our respective subjectivities as being aberrant. And the conservative Black Christians who othered my friend Jarrell Robertson Brown were adhering to the constrictions placed on Black bodies by mission Christianity that was the invention of whiteness. This brings me to the last section of the paper, challenges facing contemporary Methodism. A very quick example of one of the challenges that we face is the notion of colorblind, contextless forms of stationing for presbyters and deacons in the Methodist Church. Now I want to argue that one of our holy grails of Methodism, which is connectionism, and particularly this presumption that people who offer for the full-time work will be deployable across the connection. It's predicated on the fallacy that all bodies are perceived equally acceptable in all spaces. So we match people to context and context to people, seemingly, and I say seemingly because I've never been part of the station process, but it seems to operate with little regard to socio, political, or cultural norms at play in how various bodies are received. That the notion that anyone can be sent anywhere is an invention of whiteness, because that has never been the exception, that has never been the expectation or the reality for Black bodies. It is true that everyone can be sent everywhere. But I know from bitter experience that there are particular spaces and places where Black people feel safe. It's no surprise that the norm for many Methodists, for many of us, remains the iconic figure of John Wesley, who was, let's remind ourselves, an Oxbridge white male. And let's not forget that across the 270 or so years of having people involved in representative ministry, it's only until the last 40 or 50 years that most of those ministers have not been white, heterosexual men. So is it any wonder, therefore, that this particular norm are the ones who experience difficulties, that those who don't fit this norm, are the ones who experience difficulties in stationing and the exercise of their ministry across a colourblind connection? The one aspect of the unrecognised white template of normality that underpins Methodism can be seen in the assumption around stationing and itinerancy. White men can go anywhere. The existence of the British Empire shows us that. I still find it interesting that Black, British-born, working-class people, often formed in safe inner-city contexts where we are numerous and indeed are one of the few places where we are the norm, all those processes help us then to candidate. And I have to say that in the 13 years I worked at Queen's, I can still count on one hand the number of Black people like myself who candidated for ministry. But those are the places that shape us. And then once we go through the difficult process of candidating, training, and then stationing, we then sent off to white rural areas where Black people are still seen as a novelty. But our role, working again on one of these existing norms of whiteness, which is the notion of Black redemptive suffering, is that our place is to go there and to conscientize and educate other people. So the fact that we catch hell in the meantime is of little significance, because that's the role of Black suffering, is to make white people feel better and to educate them. A costly grace for us and cheap grace for a white institution. I've lost count of the number of times in which the manifest whiteness of meetings in which I have sat has never been noted. And the way in which whiteness underpins our very thought processes by how we do theology and what are the norms by which we are regulating and judging people's acceptability for ministry. I remember once sitting on a connectional candidates committee when a Black working class woman was asked a question: what do you do when the candle goes out? And there was a long pause. So once the student could understand the metaphor, and metaphors are always culturally dangerous means of assessing truth, given how they're open to misunderstanding and are indeed often very much tied into particular socio-cultural norms. Then indeed, once the student could understand the question and recognize that the metaphor namely meant that the candle represents God's presence, she responded, "I cannot answer that question." When pressed to respond, she asserted, and I quote her, "I can't answer that because the candle never goes out. Black people would not have survived if it did." End of quote. She was turned down on the grounds of theological naivety. I won't say any more about that. This particular construct is but one example of a larger set of assumptions and norms that govern the Methodist Church. Now, it may be difficult, indeed maybe impossible, to deconstruct whiteness and to rethink the sea that we have now come to see as normality. It may be impossible to change, but simply assuming that it should remain inviolate, we sow the seeds for possible systemic injustice to continue, all the while convincing ourselves that all these things are of God and therefore should remain normative. Some antidote to this is the radical task of redefining the norm. And by redefining the norm, I'm speaking of the ways in which what we need is an acute form of systemic analysis, simply asking that traditional question that comes out of liberation theology and a hermeneutic of suspicion is, who benefits from the ways in which we do things? Who benefits? That despite all our best rhetoric of change and transformation, our church, in particular hierarchy, is as white now as it would have been 50, 60 years ago. Actually, let me be more brutal about this. If there was a policy of apartheid in Britain in which there was an active decision-making process to exclude Black and brown bodies, I doubt that imposition of a policy could be any more significant and revelatory than our present situation, in which, for example, in the Learning Network where I once worked, at this moment in time, to the best of my knowledge, there's not one Black Methodist of African Caribbean descent working as a learning development officer in 21st century Britain. So in conclusion, perhaps this present moment, post George Floyd and the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, is the start of a prophetic breakthrough, or alternatively, it could be another false dawn. The great Danish philosopher and theologian Søren Kierkegaard once observed that life is lived forwards but understood backwards. Ultimately, history will judge us all. It seems that this government is very, very intent upon quickly returning us to normal. But as many of us know, the old normal was a very dangerous and bad place to be if you were poor, if you were a working class woman, if you were disabled, if you have the wrong sexuality, and if you're a person in the wrong color skin. It is my hope that our return to normal will be a new normal, not the old normal. It's my hope that anti-racism and a commitment to the fundamental tenets of liberation theologies and the preferential option for the most marginalized and the oppressed, especially those with Black bodies, will be the new mode of our new normal. This may be an unrealistic hope, but what is a people indeed? Any people without hope? I remain committed to a liberative, prophetic hope that believes in transformative change. I leave the last words to one of my all-time greatest heroes, James, who said this: "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." Thank you for listening.